Welcome back to episode 26 of the Grappling Growth podcast with me, Joe Testouri. Today, we are joined by our first female guest. I know it's a crime I've taken so long to get a woman on. Bad me, but we're going to make more female appearances. I guess my network just generally entails a lot more men than women. I'm joined by one of my agency clients, Stephanie Crain, who is the founder of Tapas Innovation, a leadership consultancy based in Austin, Texas. On today's call, we hardly talk about business. We hardly talk about what it makes to make a great leader. Instead, we actually talk about her PTSD from having over 20 operations as a kid, waking up in the middle of an operation, her addiction, her drug addiction when she was a teenager, having her daughter when she was 22 and how it changed her life. If you're looking for a raw, honest, uncut podcast episode, then I really, really encourage you to listen to this podcast. Thank you guys. I love you all. Take care.
As entrepreneurs, we all experience challenges in our business journey. I'm Joe Testouri, and the Grappling Growth podcast is my attempt at documenting my entrepreneurial journey while building my brands. I sit down with fellow entrepreneurs, understanding how they grapple with growth. I hope you find value and enjoy.
Stephanie, how are you doing today? How's your day been?
Hi, Joe. I'm doing wonderful, actually. My day's been great.
Lovely. So just so the audience knows, you and I, we work together. You're one of our clients, and we've got some amazing, exciting community building projects that we have in store that's coming up for the rest of 2024. And away from that, you've got a book that's launching. So I guess kind of a combobulation of all of those things right now for you. And this is a question I always ask people to kick things off. What does growth look like to Stephanie?
Wow. Okay. So that question for me is, I very much believe in sort of the universal messages. And I was having this conversation with my husband just this morning. And I was talking about it somewhat in juxtaposition to the clients that I work with. Because when I'm asking this question to a lot of my clients, it's very, very tangible. It's very kind of rooted in corporate success and the amount of money they want to be making by a certain time, or the title or the role that they want to be at. And it's very goal oriented. And I think that that's important. I think that's really powerful. But for me, growth is being authentic and comfortable with who I am. And it's being able to show up the way that I want to. It's being able to use my voice, to be able to set boundaries for myself, or to just create space for myself where I feel empowered. And so I think that, finances and positions and things like that can really support a lot of sort of like things that I want to be able to do and how I want to be able to use my energy and stuff. But real growth for me is a very internal experience. And so, yeah, that's it just, yeah.
In your opinion, why do you think people gravitate so heavily towards monetaristic and financial goals as being the beacon of growth?
I think it's a part conditioning. I think, we're real conditioned, not just, I'm in America, but I work with people all over the world. As a matter of fact, I only have one US based client right now. Most of my clients are, literally based on different continents. But I see very similar experiences no matter where people are from a cultural level. Corporate culture really permeates the entire world. And so corporate culture is, the foundation of corporate culture is logos, logic, right? Well, I mean, we live on the logos. It's like everybody has a logo, but it's more than just that identity aspect. It's the logic and the structure, and everything has to be measured, and everything has to be defined, and everything has to fit into a box. And so we are taught to define ourselves in that same way. And these are the easiest ways to measure ourselves. How much money do you make? I make this much. That's a measurement. How many promotions have you had? I've had this many. That's a measurement. These are real easy, logical ways that we can sort of measure. But I speak to a lot of people who oftentimes they're in a growth phase and they realize they may be reaching these goals. They may be getting these externalized things. And there's sort of this either it's never enough. So there's always got to be more. And the satisfaction or the fulfillment aspect isn't there. Or they're just in this internalized state of recognizing that they want more than just the externalized measurement. But they don't necessarily know how to obtain it. They don't necessarily know what that looks like.
Would you say you've always had the worldview you currently have, or has that adapted into the one you have today? Were you ever focused on money and seeing that as the beacon of growth?
No, I've always been the weird one in my family. I have a really non-traditional trauma-informed background, and I don't talk about it a lot. It's relevant to my worldview, so that's why I would bring it up here, but it's not so much relevant to my day-to-day life. But I've had around 25 surgeries, and more than half of those happened in my early childhood before I was 10. And then I experienced childhood trauma. I woke up during surgery and saw myself in surgery. And that developed complex PTSD for me that wasn't diagnosed until I was in my mid-30s. So I took a different path than many people. It wasn't a traditional one. While a lot of people were graduating from high school and going on to college, I was dealing with drug addiction and mental health issues. So I had to find a path towards self-healing very early in life. Otherwise, I don't think I would be sitting in front of everybody today. And so I entered the corporate world just with a totally different perspective, maybe a very naive one, but I just sort of showed up like, hey, I'm here and there's things I want to do. And, no, I wasn't. My first job was in sales, and I did extremely well in sales. In the first year I was in sales, I did 48% of revenue out of 5 sales reps, and made more money that year than I ever honestly made before or since. Just was able to buy a car with cash one month, and I was never so physically ill in my life. I was never I quit that job and went to school for graphic design, and just wanted to. And I work with salespeople who I think are great at what they do, and I admire them so much. The energy and the commitment that they put into the relationship with their customers and the problem solving. But that for me kept me up at night, and I absorbed it all and internalized it. So it just didn't work for me. And the money, there could never be enough money to make it work. So I learned that really early on about myself. Like in my early 20s, I knew this about myself.
I know you've alluded to your PTSD before, and I've never dared to ask you about it because I always think subjects like that, they come out when and if the person wants to reveal. So thank you first and foremost for sharing what you've gone through. And I mean, that's a very adversity induced childhood and adolescence period. And for you to say that you wouldn't be sat here today, that's very humbling and powerful. And also to acknowledge that, yeah, money's great. And that was the most financially powerful year of my life. And this was a conversation I was having with someone else the other day. I shot a podcast the other day. It's no matter whatever we look to do in life, there's a cost. So if you want more freedom, there's possibly a cost on your finances. If you want to work harder, then there's a cost on the relationship with your husband or wife or whoever. And I think maybe it's more prevalent amongst younger people, but we think we can have everything at the same time. But life gives us different things at different times and teaches us different lessons, and it's very difficult. So for you, when you're in that sales job, I take it, were you physically ill from the job, or was there other variables in your life at play?
No, it was really the job. I actually broke out into hives. My hands were covered in hives. I was so stressed out in that job. And it was literally just the stress of, it's something I learned about myself in terms of, and I was young at that time. I didn't know a lot about setting boundaries. I didn't know a lot about managing my own time. And, I showed up I always try to show up in a servant leadership perspective. Like I believe and was taught and raised to believe that you can lead from every level. Leadership is really about your character and how you show up in the world, and sort of doing what you say you're going to do, and being willing to learn, and being willing to be accountable and take responsibility. And so everything to me is an opportunity for learning. And at that time in my life, there was a lot that I needed to learn about myself. But I listened to my body. You ask, was it because I was ill? No, it wasn't because I was ill, but because I was ill, I had such a relationship with my body. I was so in tune with myself, more so than I think the average person is, that it's much easier for me to kind of look at that and go, well, that's not working. That's not good. Let's move on. Let's find what works. And so I honored that aspect of how I was responding, and just, I learned what I needed. I learned a lot at that job. It was actually for setting the stage for my career. It was probably one of the most important foundational jobs I ever did.
And what were you selling?
I was selling network integration services to enterprise level organizations. So high-end technology. I was self-certified in multiple different technologies. And, was really passionate about the work that I did. I really loved being in the tech space. It was during the 90s. So it was a very tumultuous and exciting time for technology. And so it was a really, I got to sell Y2K prevention services. So that should date me in a particular way.
I'm going to have to Google that in a second.
Yeah, you'll have to tell Y2K, year 2000. You will have to, you should Google that. Though everybody thought the world was going to come to an end and that all computers would shut down when we went to the year 2000. And so I made a lot of money off of Y2K, and I am not upset about that.
So talking about that time period, you were in your 20s then. What advice would you give to 20-year-old Stephanie?
Not to be so self-critical. I mean, really, just to be in that space of wanting to learn and grow, but not to beat myself up so much. I think the negative self-talk is something that we're also conditioned towards.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's something that, we get conditioned by other people. You talked about values earlier, and that is a big part of it. Like understanding my own values and how I want to express those values is sort of critical to my well-being, right? And I think a lot of people, and I don't think that we just come out of the gate knowing that. I think we are conditioned with values from all sorts of spaces. And when I talk about values, they're very transactional, right? Like what you value when you're 20 is maybe different than what you value when you're 40 versus what you value when you're 60. Those values might change. Different than principles, right? Like principles are something we might like fight or die for, right? Those don't really change. They just kind of hold with you. But values are transactional. They change over time. And I think we absorb values everywhere we go. So we have family values that we're raised with. We have community values. We may have spiritual or religious values. We go to work for a job and that company says they have values, and, we hope that's true. And, like there's value, we have values in our, all of this, we're absorbing and negotiating our values constantly. It's just a constant negotiation. The more you understand what you value, the easier that negotiation becomes. Because if I know that, for example, I value personal expression, I value the ability to have purple hair. Okay, that's important to me. It's my purple hair is valuable to me. Whatever. I can set that value, and then I can make a decision based on that value. And if I'm not welcome in a place because I have purple hair, I can decide whether or not I want to change my hair or be engaged in that space. Like, I know what my values are, and I'm using something kind of ludicrous. But if we took that value to a core level of, I value being able to be authentic and be myself and be accepted for that and not judged. I can't control how other people perceive me, but I can control how I respond.
Has there been a value in your life that stayed consistent for as long as you can remember?
Self-expression.
What does that mean to you?
To be able to be authentic and not to be a different person for different people. I'm the same person no matter who I'm talking to.
You've used the word probably 3 or 4 times now, authentic, and I'm curious as to get your definition of authentic, and you've just briefly touched upon it there, because I think in generally the audience of people who watch this podcast are in their 20s generally, and the reason why I wanted to start this podcast was to give something to them in a way of documenting what founders like yourself have gone through and how you view things, and especially being a little bit older than me, just a little bit, you have a lot more life experience than I. So I'm curious about what you mean by authentic there, and how people can be more authentic.
I think we're really conditioned to compartmentalize ourselves. And a great example for me is why I'm corporate mystic. I can be very corporate. And if I turned my camera around and showed you the space I'm in, you'll see a crystal ball. You will see candles. You will see, I am incredibly mystic. I'm very spiritual as a person. I'm very artistic and creative. I can show up extremely authoritative. I can be intimidating, intense, harsh, a bitch. I can be these things. All these things are me. I don't hide those things. I instead figure out how to find the power inside each one of those aspects of who I am. I try to honor the aspects of myself that are calling for attention. I try to understand, what does it need? What am I looking for there? What am I trying to protect when I'm being intimidating? Do I need to be intimidating? So to me, being authentic is looking at myself honestly first, and by honestly, without judgment, like with love, like through loving eyes. Like, I'm not judging these aspects of myself as good or bad. I'm just looking at them as a part of who I am and trying to understand how I can show up wholly, just wholly and unapologetically. And my goal and the way that I want to be in life, I want to heal and help people. So if I'm not allowing myself to show up wholly in that space, then I'm holding back things that will allow me to actually accomplish what I feel like is my purpose. So it's almost responsibility in that sense.
About 10 or so minutes ago, you mentioned your PTSD, going through over 20 operations and then turning to addiction. How long has it taken for you to become authentic given all of this? Because I can't imagine the Stephanie at, say, 20 years old being the Stephanie that you are today.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So for me, a big piece of that part of my life happened very early. I became addicted to drugs around the age of 13. When I finished my addiction, it was a combination of cocaine and speed. But I would say I used drugs. I didn't care. I didn't really care. I was what they might call a super addict. I had a near-death experience. I did overdose. I died. I was defibrillated, brought back. So I experienced death already. I think I experienced it more than once in my early life. So these were things that for me, I had concluded my drug use and I went through treatment. I did but I didn't get diagnosed for PTSD until I was in my 30s. So I didn't actually have PTSD treatment until then, but I had stopped using drugs long before then. I met and married my husband when we were 20. And, we've been together for 35 years, and we have a 33-year-old daughter and a granddaughter that we just got, so we sort of broke all the rules. I was supposed to overdose, die, and, my life would have just fizzled away. And that's just not what happened, because I have a thriving desire to be alive. I just had things inside me that I didn't understand. And addiction is often that. It's often a suppression of extreme pain. And that is certainly what it was for me. It was extreme pain, nightmare. And I mean, actual terror, extreme terror. And so I was fortunate. I was very fortunate to go through all that. And by the time I was 20, even though I didn't get to go to college or have like that normal experience, I was starting a family, and I was already falling back in love with myself, realizing the value of who I was. And, being able
in and around when you were pregnant.
So when I found out I was pregnant, I was in treatment. I was actually, I was in a treatment center and not feeling well. And I found out I was pregnant, and the treatment center at the time, they wanted me to terminate the pregnancy because I only weighed like 95 pounds. I was very, very, very sick. I was very, very deep into my addiction. And for me, I knew that I had to make, I believe people should choose what they need to in their life. And for me at that time, even though it seemed like the most ludicrous decision ever, I knew that I had to have that. I knew I had to have my child. And so I left treatment. I actually left treatment. And, my husband at the time, he was my boyfriend. And we were living away from my home. I went back to Texas, where I live. And I just got clean. And, it's what I wanted in my life. I wanted to live, and I wanted to thrive. Those were two things that were true. And so, my path of emotional healing, from that point, it's always been my path. That's always been the prevalent side of my path, is that emotional growth. And when I would go into corporate spaces, and I still do to this day, there's so many people that really struggle in corporate spaces because, the corporate world wants to pretend that emotions don't exist, and that we all show up like, robots, and we get our job done. And even though we're not supposed to bring our personal life to work with us, we are absolutely supposed to bring our work life home. And so these things, these dichotomies that I think cause so much pain in society, and I just see it through a different lens. I think because I've always had to manage health and pain against whatever it was I wanted to do. And if that was going to be what defined me, well, then nothing else, I couldn't be defined by anything else. And so it just was always important to me to not let that be like the defining factor, but to utilize it. It informs me. It doesn't define me. It informs me. And it informs me in ways that I have immense gratitude for. Like just immense gratitude for.
Well, you've, as we said just before jumping on air, I said there's a few questions I always kind of go back to, but the road is intertwined. And it's so cool with these podcasts because I get so many different experiences with people, and I learn more and more about them. And you and I, we have our calls fortnightly, but we've never really touched upon this. And I thought it'd be really nice to have a different setting to talk. So if we talk about corporate mystic, Tapas Innovation, you're talking about in your 20s, and then you worked in the corporate world, kind of delving into the entrepreneurial side of you. I mean, I know you've got the creative, the entrepreneurial side, and these are all merged into one like a blender. Tapas Innovation, what was the inspiration behind starting the brand?
That's so I was at the time I was working as the head of marketing for a yoga studio and a culinary education school. And I was doing a lot of research around branding around food and yoga and trying to find concepts that were related. And I came across the term tapas. And I came across the term, you would think very obviously like, oh yeah, tapas is food and that's how, but no, I was doing all this research on yogic energy. And in my research, I came across a description of an energy in Hindu religion, Eastern spirituality. It's tapas energy. And it is a very disciplined, in a spiritual space, it's an incredibly disciplined, austere form of energy. It is the energy that it's sort of the discipline required to bring order from chaos. And for me, chaos and order. And so if you think about like the energy required to create life, right? Like you have total mass chaos. You have all this like energetic stuff happening, and then sperm meets egg, boom, we have order and life starts to form, literally. So like chaos to order. And it is a deep feminine energy. And it's a fiery energy. And for me, I have a culinary chef degree. I am also trained as a Kundalini yoga instructor. And I also have specialization training in Ayurvedic studies. And so for me, it very much just embodied a healing belief system for myself. And if you look at tapas from a more creative perspective, taking it out of that spiritual space and just kind of elevating the concept or taking the concept into a creative space, it really is that ideal of like, how do you discipline yourself enough to start something and then follow through with it? How do you take this like ideal that's like, all over the place and a million different things are happening at once, and how do you bring that into something that you can see and focus on and then expand and grow? And so the word for me immediately resonated. I kept it for myself.
And how long have you been running Tapas for?
7 years. It started out as marketing consulting, and it's evolved.
And I'm sure there's been several, but okay, what was the biggest moment in business where you thought, all the chips are down, I'm going to quit?
It's interesting. It's not really how I think. I haven't thought that yet. Good. About tapas, right? And I've been in some pretty tight spaces with it. But I feel like it's the most purposeful thing I've ever done. So I'm not sure why I would give up on it so easily.
What was one of the hardest things you've come across in business where you thought, this is tight, I don't know how I'm going to manage?
I think being a solopreneur all by itself is hard. And I think one of the hardest things was like letting go of things that I did professionally on my own that I did well when I did them, and had to acknowledge that, as I'm focusing my skills and developing there's attrition and technology advances. And so while I can try to keep up, one of the most important questions that somebody asked me at one point was like, are you trying to be a full-time designer, or are you trying to be a coach that's going to change people's lives? And having been a graphic designer for most of my life, it's like having to answer that question of like, well, I mean, no, I'm not trying to be a full-time designer. Thank you for asking. And so I think it's just sort of admitting as a solopreneur, like where you need help. And the hardest pieces of that are really making those right choices when you have finite resources and you have, each choice matters. And So, but it really comes down to like trusting myself and my intuition and my own instincts, and then following through, just really following through.
So on that,
So,
and
okay,
I gave you a little bit of
I
prep
have
before. What are your
two of
top
them
three book
sitting right here.
recommendations?
One, I always recommend this book because, especially when I was young, for me, this gave me so much insight in a different way than there's so many personality tests and things out there. But I recommend StrengthsFinder. I think that StrengthsFinder is still relevant today. And I have had this book for so long that mine came with stickers and I could actually put my stickers on. And so I go back to this frequently. And what's also interesting is when I have, when I know people who have done this and we compare our strengths, like in collaborative spaces and stuff like that, I just think it brings up like really interesting perspective, and like it approaches the way that we think, I think, differently than a lot of other personality tests. So, for example, one of my strengths is being futuristic. And that's something that I would say that I have always known about myself. But then it's also one of those things that's like, well, how do you tell people that you're futuristic? Like, how do you tell people that? Like, how do you even, and then in taking the test and having it clarified for me, like what that means in the way that I think. And it made so much sense. And it helped me align to how I can actually use that strength to my advantage in the way that I plan, in the way that I strategize, in the way that my intuition functions. Right. And so it's things like that that I think it really helped me gain more understanding. The next book I want to recommend, and I've been on a Firehouse recommending this year. I know the authors. It is Be a Better Team by Friday, by Justin Fallon and David Greenspan. And this is just a great book, y'all. This is great for leaders. Oh my God. Like, please, all leaders read the book now. Okay. Like, just do it. And you'll be like, today is what, Wednesday? Okay. Like, I don't know. Read it. You'll be a better team by Friday. It doesn't matter what day you pick. And the last book I want to recommend, this is very self-aggrandizing, but I'm publishing a book and it's coming out in a week. And it's called Brand Shadow. And it is a guide to understanding and overcoming corporate toxicity. And so I'd like to recommend that book to your audience.
Absolutely. And we will put a link in the description on YouTube, Spotify, and everywhere where we post it. So
I jokingly tell people,
expand
I'm pretty sure I wrote a book that's just going to make everybody angry. It's really, I'm sorry. No, thank you. He's not, and he's not even mentioned actually. So maybe that'll make everybody feel better. I don't like to give like too much airspace to people who don't need it. But for me, the book is a little bit of a self perspective, self journey. It's well researched, but it looks at sort of how we're conditioned in corporate spaces. And so, I think the first chapter is, dream job, second chapter, perfect candidate, and it just sort of the idea is to take you through a guided exploration of sort of how we got to where we're at with toxic corporate spaces. But at the end of each chapter, there are journal questions and action items for the individual reader to sort of explore these concepts for themselves. What have you been taught? What has your family taught you? What do you buy into? I make recommendations for people to explore, different cultures, different generations, doing things where I feel like we've been very divided, and corporate spaces have been divisive in general, and just trying to kind of open up our minds to what the possibilities would be if we could be more aligned. And the biggest part for me, and I talk to people all the time, they work in toxic spaces, they have toxic bosses, they have toxic coworkers, and I actually don't believe that everybody in the world is toxic. I actually believe most people are trying to show up doing what they think is right. And what they think is right may or may not be healthy or good. It's almost always based on what they've been taught and what they've accepted for themselves. And so I really ask people to take a look at how they show up in corporate spaces, regardless of whether you're a leader or an employee, or you're in some middle management position in between, or however you are. What energy are you bringing to this environment? And because I really don't believe that we're going to change toxic corporate spaces by just asking leaders to be better leaders. I think they would if they knew how. I don't think that people set out intentionally to be nefarious. I'm not naive. I know some people do, but I think that I generally believe in the whole of people, and that people are good. And so the book really asks people to sort of examine that. How are you showing up, and what can you do to empower yourself and contribute to the healing process, as opposed to succumbing to the toxicity?
There you go, brand shadow. I massively think there's a big difference in the organizational structure between bosses and leaders. And I've always aspired to being a leader, someone who leads by example, who will do any job that they would ask anyone within their team or company to do. And I've always said to myself, and this is something I said from as a teenager, and my friend kind of questioned me on it. I said, I pay more respect to the toilet cleaners and bin men than I would do to CEOs, because at the end of the day, we're all humans. And why does one person, just because they've got a title, deserve exponentially more respect than others? And don't get me wrong, I'll try to pay respect to everyone evenly, but the people who, in my view, turn around and treat everyone equally and with respect, they're the people who build the best organizations. And I've worked with tons of people who are bosses, and they're not great people to be with. And I always think they get stuck at a fairly low level in business, whereas the best people that I've partnered with, that I've worked with, they've viewed me as a partner. They've used inclusive words such as we and us, and it makes such a transcendent difference between what they do and how they operate their companies and organizations. So that's always been a thing that I've always really, really tried to echo into my mind. And anyone who joins my team, I always say that we work together. I don't say, oh, this person works for me, because I think it's too possessive at times. And I think there's a lot of people who revel in saying that. Stephanie, thank you. You've provided a lot of context, and more specifically, you've opened up massively. So perfect. We will put links into everywhere where people can find you. Thank you so much for your time. It was a joy talking to you, and not just getting to know, I don't know, maybe corporate mystic, but actually Stephanie behind the business and everything creative and wonderful that you're doing. Thank you.